Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this morning to see my talk. As we mentioned, my name's Irene Ros, and I want to take a few minutes of your time to actually talk about a place that I call home, where I work these days, Bocoup, and some of the things that we learned about building a company on open source. So a little bit about me. I'm a programmer. I've been programming since I've been 9. It's my core passion, and it's what I'll do for as long as I can. And right now, I've been focusing on JavaScript. I'm very passionate about the web, and as the rest of our friends at Bocoup. But I actually started off, as we mentioned, doing data visualization work at IBM in the IBM research group. And it was a fantastic 3 years of my life. I worked on amazing prototypes with amazing folks. And towards the end of my tenure there, everything I built was built using open source, from my tooling to my deployment to my production environments. Everything was on open source. And it was an amazing time because I learned so much about how to write software from the open source community. But at the same time, that came at a bit of a cost because all I really wanted to do was go and write code and deploy it really fast and get users. But it became hard. I had to sort of work with a lot of lawyers and negotiate licensing things, and practically speaking, that took up a lot of my time. But the worst part came because with the fact that I couldn't actually contribute a lot of my code back. There were ways to do that, and IBM is a huge player in the open source community. For anyone who's used Dojo, they've done so much for that project. But we were a really small and agile group, and so I really couldn't take the time. And it was a very one-sided relationship. I took a lot and I gave nothing, so we all know how that works. And so luckily for me, completely by happenstance, I stumbled upon this amazing group of people, and I found Bocoup. And for those of you that haven't heard of us before, we are a small consultancy in Boston. We're an open web technology company, and we've been fortunate enough to work with clients all over the world. I'm quite jet lagged from being 3 weeks in London myself, and so I'm very excited to sort of be able to work with these amazing folks. Structurally speaking, there are 15 of us. There's 11 engineers and 4 folks that coordinate everything from our training to operations to community development. And most of us are based in Boston, but some of us are remote, and we get together every so often for Bocoup Fest, which we actually have next week. I'm very excited about. But really, what I'm here to talk about is sort of the core of our company, because, well, we're very young when we started it, which I wasn't there for, sadly. But the goal was really to run a business that is committed to open source in a sustainable way, right? We're really all about making open source a viable alternative to closed source software. And there's 3 different ways in which we do that. So the first being that we see a successful implementation of open source for our clients, the best way to get them to see the benefit of open source in their systems, right? If we help them put open source processes and open source code into what it is they're building and have it be a successful endeavor, they're just more likely to do that in the future. As I mentioned, we have a community director. We really believe that bringing the community together around open source projects that are growing is the best way to grow those communities and grow those projects. And we have an event space that we like to give people, as they ask for it, for free. And we run a lot of events and meetups. And these days, we're also organizing quite a few conferences, which is very exciting for us. And last but not least, we really believe in helping engineers grow, right? So if everyone becomes an expert in open source libraries, then there'll be no one who's an expert in closed source libraries. And so we all teach our own classes. We all write them as part of our job, and making them very practical and also very thorough. And a lot of our conversations with clients start off by explaining the perils of closed source software and what it can do to your projects if you don't know what is behind all this code that you're putting into your system and relying on heavily. But at the same time, what we don't do is preach the open source mantra, right? Because we understand that every client has their own set of needs and their own set of preconditions and organizational challenges and policies. And practically speaking, open source isn't just a pile of code. Open source is a way of existing and a way of working together and communicating. And so what we really focus on is finding the things that fit for their needs and bringing those little bits and pieces and putting them together in a way that, again, is very sustainable. And so to be able to do all these things, we actually had to, I had to sit down and figure out what are some of our priorities. And there are some proper organizational foundations that I realized we lay at Bocoup. And some of them actually don't start with open source. We prioritize our people first, with open source coming a close second, and profit actually being a lazy third. And this is a direct quote from our managing director, Pete Carl. And so when thinking about people, the reason we realized that we need to think about people first is because we want people to both love the work that they're doing, but also love the place that they're doing it at. Because I'm sure all of us have been in situations where we loved our job, but I hated the environment we were in, or absolutely loved our environment, but just weren't inspired by the work. And so we said, okay, how can we optimize for both things, right? And so one of the first things that was easy for us to do because we are small is to create a very flat organization, right? We certainly have our management team that does a lot for us, but at the same time, we are incredibly autonomous and we have a lot of decision-making power. And while this may not be an easy thing to replicate in the large organizations, I would actually argue that within those organizations, it is possible to create a pretty flat tree. No project that I've ever been on where every single person had a role was very efficient, let me tell you that. At the same time, we also want our engineers to be able to focus on the actual craft of programming. So we focus a lot on separating some of the contractual and negotiation things from the engineering team, and let them interface with the client on the things that matter, on the actual code and the goals that we're putting together. Simultaneously, when we do interface with the clients, we're very focused on doing it in the right way. So at no point in time will we actually sit there on a stand-up call every day for 2 hours, because that is not a very efficient process. But what we do care about is using standard communication practices that we all have grown to love, right? We're going to use bug tracking and code style consistency and documentation to a point of obsession. If any of you follow any of us on Twitter, you'll probably see an argument about it at some point next week. And a really important organizational policy that kind of came together after, pretty early on is that we prioritize people's passion over a lot of financial perks. So if any of you are hiring or have been trying to hire, you'll probably expect that all engineers want their own monkey and a barista and a scooter to ride around. But to be honest, that's actually not practical and not necessarily appealing to sort of the core passions that bring us to engineering, that bring us to development. And so what we decided to do is actually prioritize perks that end up making our engineers feel like they're growing in an environment that is good for sort of their engineering chops. And so first we have a professional development budget that everyone can use on conferences and learning materials and so on. But even more importantly, and what I'm excited about is that we all really get 7 weeks of open source development time. It's not tied to any client work, and it really just lets us focus on the projects that we love and kind of taking a lot of those patterns that we're learning over time and putting them to use. And that practically translates to actually a quarter of our yearly revenue. So this is a very conscious commitment that our management has taken, and something that we are all really grateful for. And last but not least, and something that is really important to me, is that the culture at Bocoup is ever evolving. We've grown very fast, and we've evolved over time with every person that comes to the group. And there's so many tropes out there about how you should be if you're a startup. What specific things you should do as part of your culture, and how you should behave and how you should communicate. But when you restrict your culture in this way, it actually ends up being limiting over time and becomes exclusive, especially when you're bringing people who are from a more diverse background. And so I'm very excited about the fact that we've never done that at Bocoup, and that every time someone new comes along, they kind of bring their passions to the table. And so now that we've laid a lot of these ground rules, we get to sort of the crux of the story and why we felt this was a sustainable model for us to follow. Why would we dedicate so much of our revenue and our time and our passions to open source? And so the first being is actually that open source creates happy developers. So those are two of my teammates, Mike and Dan. And what we've learned, practically speaking, is that engineering itself can be a very rewarding activity when you're building things that you can give away to to other people, that is very rewarding. At the same time, we're all very social creatures. I don't know any other industry that has so many conferences, to be honest, as many as we do. And open source lets you simultaneously be involved in many large communities and many small communities, kind of beyond your immediate 2 to 3 person team. And so, practically speaking, we're all much happier to be able to participate in an environment like this. And to be honest, working with open source projects makes you honest. You have to make a great project, you have to write it well, you have to test it well, you have to document it well, you have to support it all the time, you have to answer your users. And when you're writing code for thousands of other people, let me tell you, you don't snooze. You know, you're looking at what is happening all the time, and you're being honest with everyone. And that is a great practice to bring to our other code too. So we are all better architects for it. Our client projects are much better architected for it, and we get to talk about architecting code, which we all love to do as well. And when you think about the fact that investing in open source does take up time, I'd like to say that it actually contributes a lot to your future, right? Because if you write open source code that is reusable, you can use it on your next projects. And that happens to us all the time. And the other great thing about developing software together in a community with other people that is diverse, both culturally and professionally, is that the direction of the technology is not influenced by a single vendor. And we can see that a lot in the browser wars. Things like prefix CSS properties are going away, hopefully over time. And to me, that's a really important point of the technology moving in a way that is truly best for its consumers. And so I'd like to say that it always works, but there are perils to sort of adopting a model like this that involves both a commitment to open source and clients. Practically speaking, when you throw a lot of passionate people at a problem, they can burn out. And open source projects can be very demanding. The more successful they are, the more they can take over your life, and that becomes a problem when other priorities come knocking. And frankly, contributing your open source to the community does mean you're giving up intellectual property. And I won't stand and preach against or for intellectual property, or you can probably guess my thoughts on that. But I would argue that at the very least, there's always going to be code that is of high value to the community and of low intellectual property value to you. And so identifying it and asking those thorough questions is a great way to start contributing back. And I would also say that sometimes writing your project and writing your code in the open source world has other benefits in that you can actually see whether it's working. Imagine if you go through the trouble of writing something for 2 years and never showing it to anybody. It may be a terrible idea and you've just wasted all this time. And last but not least, for us, it's a bit of a new economy. We've only been around for about three years or so, and we happen to found a formula that works for us. But I can't say that it's a recipe yet. So I would actually love to hear about other folks who have done similar things and find that it works or doesn't. There are also myths that I actually think are not true. Various comments that folks make about open source that I believe can be very easily debunked. One being that open source is hard to maintain, that you're bringing in other people's code that is hard to understand, and so on. But I would actually say that understanding the core of your application, understanding the libraries that you rely on and how they're built is profoundly empowering. Because when you understand the internals that your system is built on, when things go wrong, you can fix it. When the maintainer decides they don't want to work on something anymore, you can pick it up. And practically, that knowledge is power. That knowledge is what lets you take your system to a different direction at any point in time, something that you might not be able to do with a closed source library, especially if it no longer becomes supported. Obviously, not all open source projects are complete. There's always going to be missing functionality, no matter how hard we try to cover all the corner cases. But the beautiful part about it being open source is that there are a lot of other people who feel the same thing and are willing to take the time and write the extensions. Many times when I needed something myself, I would just ask the community, and the community would do it for me or already had an existing solution. And then when you have the time and you get to contribute it back, you create, again, that wonderful feedback loop. And of course, not all projects are created equal. I would say that open source is an economy like anything else. There are projects that are more successful and are better maintained, have a better community than other projects. And understanding that and knowing how to measure the vitality of a project is a really important skill when you're trying to figure out what projects to use in your systems. But I would actually say that it's a really good economy, because the stronger projects are the ones that survive. So I'd like to echo, for those of you who may be in the Rails community, a long time ago there was a user who was very prolific. His name was Why the Lucky Stiff, and he wrote many libraries and even a Rails book that became very popular, until one day he decided he no longer wanted to do programming, and he deleted all his repos and he deleted his book and kind of disappeared off the face of the internet. And conveniently, because the things that he wrote were so core to the community, people resurrected all his libraries and continued to work on some of them until this very day. And so I'd like to say that when there is a project that is worth it and a project that is important to the community, no matter what happens, it's going to stick around. And last but not least, while open source does take time, and time is money, I would also say that open source is fast. And at the end of the day, you'll save a lot more time, and as a result, money, from reusing the work that other people have done for you. We are very fast at Bocoup. We work on average 4 weeks with a client, and we produce a working prototype at the very least. And we couldn't do that without relying on open source software. We're very grateful that that's the model that we've chosen, if only for that reason, but many others. But there are some practical considerations for actually supporting open source, especially if you are running an organization or you're in a management position that I've run into, especially when I was in a larger company. To start with, there has to be organizational support that is very clearly stated by the company, that open source is not only an approved activity, but from a legal perspective, it is encouraged. From an IP perspective, figuring out the ownership rights and hopefully giving it back to either the person writing the code or the community is incredibly important. It is really a shame when someone works on a project for a very long time and wants to release it, but at the end of the day cannot own that code. I would also say that recognizing that open source is a time commitment, and not just a single point in time, but actually an evolving life cycle. So open source does take time, and release cycles take time, and users take time. And making that time for that engineering team is profoundly important for both allowing them not to burn out on their work, and to give back to those projects that other people are relying to. And last but not least, I would say that for companies that have a process of recognizing their employees, of measuring their performance based on their work and achievements, that working on open source should be a recognized activity, that it should be something that people get kudos for, or whatever it is you do to recognize your people. And so practically speaking, the most important thing I want to say is that we all want to work with great engineers, with great people. We want to be great engineers and great people, and we want to hire them. And it's quite a challenge these days, I hear. And at the same time, we need those people to work with us on great projects and great products, and the two are inseparable, I would say. And at least for us, we found that bringing open source into the mix is the best way to do that, because as an engineer and watching the rest of my colleagues, we all become better all the time when we're working on open source code. And as a result, we do better by our clients, and we do better by the projects that we work on in the future. So thank you all so much for your time, and thank you to all my Bocoup friends who have been watching remotely. I love you all. Thank you.